Welcome to Mozilla Privacy Lab. My name is Nanette Coleman. I am a PhD candidate here in sociology at Berkeley, as well as the executive director of the Interdisciplinary Research Group on Privacy. So we'd like to welcome you tonight. And I want to just explain why I'm here as opposed to Stacy or Kai. They both asked me to guest host. Emergencies do come up on occasion, and they both had them tonight, so I'm trying to stand in for them. So I helped select our speakers tonight. They are all participants in the Privacy Law Scholars Conference, which comes to Berkeley every other year. It's sometimes held here, sometimes held in Washington, D.C., and we are trying to coordinate with this event so we can take advantage of the exceptional scholars that are in town for that event. So there is a sort of a common way we do this. So we tend to begin by asking if anyone is new to this event. Is there anybody who's never been to a Mozilla Privacy Lab before? Oh, this is fantastic. It's most of our audience. So we want to welcome you. This is a meetup for people who are interested in digital privacy. The goal is to bring together privacy professionals and privacy community members at nonprofits, for-profits, and NGOs alike to foster communication and collaboration. Our general format is to spend the first half hour eating, check, did that. Socializing and getting settled, check, did that. Technological issues, check, those happen too. Then spend the next hour or so hearing from our speakers and asking them questions. And then we open it up to informal networking and small group discussions for the last half hour to give people a chance to talk to each other. So before I do anything, I want to make sure I thank our hosts. So I mentioned the Interdisciplinary Research Group on Privacy. We are the main host for tonight, but we would not be here except for funding from Citrus, from the Townsend Center for the Humanities, the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, and we also have a relationship with an institute related to the internet at Stanford. So without them, this would not be possible. So definitely want to thank them. So we want to mention coming attractions. So we're still looking for speakers and hosts for June and July, but we do have August planned. On Tuesday, August 13th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Uber in San Francisco. NIST will be here to share their privacy framework and then they're planned to release that in October. They're looking for feedback on their draft. So if NIST and the privacy framework falls within your bailiwick, please plan to attend. As always, we're looking for volunteers. This would not be possible without volunteers. I want to pause and thank the undergraduates in the back who, during their summer, are here helping out. So I greatly appreciate their volunteerism, and we do need other volunteers to help with speakers and topics. So if you have ideas, please let Kai and Stacy and others know. Please make sure you join our mailing list if you're not already on it, so you can get notified about upcoming events. And as you know, Privacy Lab has a code of conduct, so we expect everyone to be respectful of each other and let us know if there are concerns. So with that said, I wanted to let you know how this is going to unfold. So I have at my left 4 exceptional scholars. I'm going to introduce them in a second. I'll begin by telling you a little bit about the things they have in common. They all know each other quite well, and I'm getting the impression that they go on the circuit and do this thing together regularly, given how quickly they were in the back hanging out and talking shop. So they'll spend 8 minutes each giving you a bit of background on their most recent work. So that could be a book in the case of 3 of our scholars, or a groundbreaking article in the case of the 4th. One of our authors actually has a book that is still in progress, which I'm very excited about. So all these people are going to share their work. So from there, we've distributed a few comment cards. If you'd like to give us questions, maybe you're feeling a little shy or you just want to make sure we have them, so we get them and you can pass those back to the students, and we'll pose that after they share their thoughts. They'll also engage in a little bit of dialogue. They probably will hear things that are interesting about each other's work and want to talk about that, so we'll make room for that. And then we'll finish off by opening it up to questions from all of you. And I do have a few questions in the event that it gets a little quiet, but I can tell from this group that it will not get quiet. So we have a great group tonight. So I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about these speakers overall, and then I'll go into their bios. So I am both humbled and honored to be in the presence of these 4 individuals. This is a panel of distinguished, internationally recognized scholars of privacy. So their impact has been academic. It's included popular press pieces. Articles, books are all within their purview. They, across the four of them, have done hundreds of talks at conferences, spoken before government panels, advised tech, as well as dominate in the classroom. And that's what I've heard. So well, I'd like to be them when I grow up. As I mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate. So across the four of them, they can speak on privacy in the 14th century all the way to the 14th of this month. So, so you can ask them widely all sorts of things. So their training is sociological, historical, they have legal lenses, they all basically do public sociology for the sociologists in the room, analysis, insight, impact, balancing understanding of both individuals and their concerns, as well as the collective action problem that is privacy. So from there, I'm going to briefly introduce each of our scholars. I encourage you to take a look at their bios on the email address. On the email invite we sent out. But I will briefly introduce them all. So on my left is Sarah Ego. Sarah is an associate professor of history, sociology, and law, the director of the program in American Studies, as well as the inaugural faculty director of the E. Bronson Ingram College at Vanderbilt. Professor Ego teaches a wide range of courses in modern U.S. cultural and intellectual history at both undergraduate and graduate levels. She will be discussing her book, The Known Citizen, A History of Privacy in Modern America, from Harvard University Press, 2018. So I've got it here. Then we've got James Rule on her left. James is currently Distinguished Affiliated Scholar of UC Berkeley's Center of the Study of Law and Society. He became fascinated with privacy and personal information as a graduate student in sociology and has been doing research and writing on these subjects ever since. He is author, co-author, editor of 4 books on this matter, including Privacy in Peril. My copy is signed, thank you very much. Oxford University Press, and numerous articles. He is going to be discussing a work in progress called Taking Privacy Seriously. On his left is Denise Anthony, a sociologist who is professor of health management and policy in the School of Public Health and the Department of Sociology, by courtesy, at the University of Michigan. Professor Anthony's work explores issues of cooperation, trust, and privacy in a variety of settings, from healthcare delivery to microcredit borrowing groups to online groups such as Wikipedia and Prosper.com. Her current work examines the use of information technology in healthcare, including effects on quality, on the organization of healthcare, as well as the implications for the privacy and security of protected health information. Professor Anthony will be discussing her groundbreaking article, Toward a Sociology of Privacy, and a review of Sociology 2017. My students are very excited because every semester my students actually annotate her article, so she has like rock star status here at Berkeley. So very excited to have her here. So, and then on her left is Danielle Citron. I believe I got your last name correct there. I did, great. Will join the faculty of Boston University School of Law as a professor of law in July 2019. Before joining BU Law, she taught at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law for 15 years. Professor Citron teaches and writes about data privacy, free expression, civil rights, and administrative law with a focus on automation. Amongst the many things she has the potential to discuss today, including sexual privacy, she will be discussing hate crimes in cyberspace, Harvard University Press, 2014. And before I hand this over to Sarah to begin our discussion, I will briefly introduce myself. I'm your moderator for this evening. I'm a PhD candidate in the sociology department here at Berkeley. My work sits at the intersection of culture and organizations. I'm interested in cybersecurity, surveillance, and privacy in the US context. I examine privacy at the individual and organizational level, specifically focused on the difference between thoughts and actions by privacy-interested individuals, as well as the different ways that organizations operate within different regulatory environments, including GDPR and our new California privacy protection law. So with that, I will hand it over to Sarah.
Okay, and shall I hold this up?
Or would you like, you're welcome to come over here too if you'd like to stand at the podium.
I'll do that.
Maybe we'll do that.
That'd be easier for me.
I think so.
Okay. Great. Well, let me thank first Nanette for the overly kind introduction, at least in my case. I have no doubt that my colleagues have international renown and dominate in the classroom, but I'm not sure I'm going to put myself in that group. At any rate, I really want to thank Nanette, who's doing really interesting work herself, both organizationally and intellectually here at Berkeley, for setting up this panel. And I'm going to try to take less than my allotted time, less than 8 minutes, so that we can get a good discussion going. But let me say, I'm the historian on the panel here. I have just published a book on the history of privacy in the 20th century, starting in the late 19th century United States. And by that I mean a history of debates over privacy, not the thing of privacy, but more so how Americans have talked about, argued over, changed their minds about privacy over time. And so I've really been focused, perhaps unlike most of you, on privacy's past. Something that actually American historians have not paid a great deal of attention to, but that I think is very helpful not only for helping us see more clearly, but possibly even as a resource for some of our debates in the present. So given that privacy talk is everywhere in contemporary political culture, it might be surprising that Americans didn't talk very much about privacy, at least in public, much before the late 19th century. Nor really were privacy rights a standard vocabulary of politics. So for a historian anyway, that feels really recent, that our privacy debates are of pretty recent vintage, 130 years old maybe, when privacy really decisively entered the public sphere, became a topic that never receded after that point. And there are a number of different reasons for that. But I want to just mention that because that sometimes surprises people, that privacy was not, in the way it is now, right at the center of public debates and politics. But across the last century or so, privacy really moved right to the center of public life. And that was my first question in doing this research, is how did it get there? How did privacy become so public? How did it become a topic we think about, need to manage, think of as part of our citizenship, our entitlements, but also as a burden that we need to spend some of our lives, some of our time thinking about. So my book was really an attempt to chart why privacy became such a fixture and even a fixation of US culture. My answer, it took me a while to get to, but my answer was really that privacy debates moved to the fore of American life as Americans, whether willingly or unwillingly, became what I call known citizens, people who are known better and better as individuals and sometimes collectively by the institutions of the larger society, which includes, of course, the state and the government, places we often think of first, but also by many, many other entities in American society. The title, The Known Citizen, which I use from my book, actually comes from a poem some of you may know, The Unknown Citizen by W.H. Auden. It's a wonderful kind of reflection on the many, many ways people are known, partially by the different institutions of modern society. And the more, after I encountered that poem and thought about it, the more it really captured some of my sense of what's missing in our privacy discussions. And that is the social organization that has sort of brought to the fore many of our dilemmas, really intractable dilemmas about privacy today. And that is that we both seek to be known and seek to be visible to many different entities in this larger society. At the same time, that in other circumstances, we seek to shield ourselves from being known. And it's that tension, that dilemma, that I think really defines modern privacy debates in the United States. As I delved into research in many different domains, I came to realize that privacy is really it's not a thing, it's not something that is a measurable quality, but really it's a debate, and it's a recurring one, about the proper boundary between citizens and their society. And in the last 100 years or so, that debate has really been about not just privacy, but it's been about the kind of society we live in, and particularly the democratic, but also capitalist and information-hungry society that emerged in the 20th century. So in the book, I track the emergence of this knowing society, one that sought to scrutinize its members in ever fuller and finer detail, often with our acquiescence and our support because of the good reasons and rationales offered for knowing us better. And I also try to examine along the way the protests that this sparked, the accommodations it demanded from individuals, and also, importantly, I think, the changes that it affected in our very notions of privacy. One of the surprises of doing this research is how very flexible and fungible our ideas about privacy have been over time, even though we typically, I think, in our public conversations think of privacy as something quite stable. It was a story, the story of the known citizen or of a knowing society. It was a story that fascinated me in part because it cuts across so many different domains of modern life. Of course, over the last 100 years, Americans have been known in a new fashion by state bureaucracies, by the police, by U.S. agencies of various kinds and state agencies, but they've also come to be known in new ways by the popular press, by journalists, advertisers, marketers, private corporations, financial institutions, scientific researchers, medical experts, by their own workplaces and schools, and most recently, and this is part of our contemporary debate, of course, by data aggregators and proprietary algorithms. So it's a project that took me on lots of unexpected paths, topics from early photography to tabloid journalism, birth certificates and documentation techniques. I became very fascinated by the story of the Social Security number. In fact, I think that's going to be another book. Architecture and suburban design play a role in this story. So does the policing of restrooms, which I took a detour into in this book. Psychological testing and experimentation and changing ideas about what was proper to investigate, academically even, in terms of human subjects, all the way to data banks, confessional memoirs, Edward Snowden, social media, and all the rest. But what I kept coming back to in that kind of wide array of topics was this same theme again and again, the dilemma of how modern societies seek to know us and the consequences of that knowing. And I just want to say, maybe in closing here, that that lens on privacy debates, I think, is a helpful one because it does not focus on bad actors or scandals or even dramatic events, but on the kind of mundane ways in which Americans have both wanted to be known and resist being known. And there are many different reasons why Americans have released information about themselves, wanted to be known better, whether for the sake of convenience or entertainment or connection or security, public health, social benefits. And to put the debate in those terms is to recognize its complexity, its thorniness, but also I think gets us closer to a productive public debate that may finally lead to answers. It's a tension, privacy, that we live with, and it's a tension that we need to recognize in making good laws and regulation, good design in engineering and software systems, in our norms, in our practices, and our ethics. And I think I will stop there and just maybe to seed the discussion a little bit for later, say that Nanette had asked us to think a little bit about some of the surprises of our research and what we discovered. And I'll say one of them I've already mentioned is privacy being a kind of latecomer to American political discourse. But there are others as well. One is the incredible trust, it seems to me in retrospect, that Americans had in state tracking systems in the 1930s, the Social Security number and Social Security system, for example. But also a surprise more generally was that rather than disappearing, which is a kind of theme of public discussions about privacy, or eroding. In certain ways, depending on how you look at it, privacy has really expanded and increased over the last century. At least our expectations about privacy have expanded. It's not just about our property lines, but our images, our psyches, our data, and I think that's actually a really useful corrective to our discussion as well. But I'll save some of that for the discussion to come, and thank again Nanette and my colleagues for taking part in what will be a great discussion tonight, I think.
Did I see some of those useful portable microphones?
Yes, one right here.
So that you can wander.
Yeah, I don't know if it's on.
Are you hearing me? No.
You're being private about your conversation.
Hold it down.
Like that? Yes, okay. I think I do better pacing back and forth. Having made my living for decades looking at seas of undergraduate and graduate faces, I don't think I know how to think on my feet unless I can move around with my feet while I'm thinking. So thanks for your indulgence. Like the people said, I'm working on a book. It's going to be called Taking Privacy Seriously. And it's a bit of a rip-off from a distinguished ethicist, Ronald Dworkin, lately deceased. But that shows in the interest of publicizing one's ideas, I'm not above anything, you know, I'm always willing to borrow. And it does imply something which is, I'll admit, from the beginning, is true, and that is, I do think in our collective social reactions to the treatment of personal information, we haven't taken privacy seriously enough. So this book is aimed at sort of goading people to take even more stringent and perhaps even painful measures to protect the values, a very diffuse collection of values that we know inexactly as privacy. The book is really not like other books I've written. It's not mainly a research report, although it's going to have a lot of facts in it about privacy practices in America. It's more of a manifesto for social movement on behalf of privacy that does not yet exist. I've grown convinced that the thoughts of people like me, I don't include my distinguished colleagues here, no matter how inspired, the thoughts of specialist researchers will not themselves suffice to bring about the kinds of practices that many of us would like to see. And so I cling to the hope that one day there will be a movement of people who believe in privacy and try to promote it much as there is are there movements for environmental justice and women's rights and the protection of open space in urban places and all these other things that have good things that have movements constituted in their names. So the book is in many ways a designation of, let's say, room for improvement in our efforts so far to make a better privacy environment, a more private world. And in this respect, it's a look at 50 years of legislation and policy governing that have been enacted since the late 1960s in many, many countries. There are now more than 100 countries in the world that have major privacy codes, and most of these privacy codes, bodies of privacy laws, are aimed at regulating the flow of information on private people to big resourceful organizations of the government or of corporate life. So everything from American Express to the NSA to the FBI and your corner grocery store. All of these consumers of personal data have made enormous strides in their activities, and governments and public opinion in turn over the last 5 decades has sought to develop bodies of law that will address the so-called privacy issue and restore our privacy or protect our privacy or however the current cliche in the matter goes. But I make the following observation about this body of law in the book, and I make it directly to you now. This body of privacy law, though it's brought certain good results, has failed to protect us against some of the most outrageous privacy developments in the last few decades. It didn't do anything to stop the accretion of government, in this country, of government surveillance into people's private communications and information exchanges, the kinds of things that were revealed 6 years ago by Mr. Snowden and which continue to be disclosed now by other sources. Those activities were outside and remain largely outside the purview of privacy law as it exists today, point one. Point two, the same body of law has done in this country virtually nothing to stop the growth of privacy eroding industries like the personal data, I don't know what properly to call it, personal data retailing industry, those big companies that often originate from ties with the insurance industry, whose work involves purchasing or otherwise scooping up vast amounts of personal data and reselling it in the forms of reports on people's details of their personal affairs to willing buyers, regardless, usually with no questions asked. So the fact that these two great big sociological developments, if you ask me, can have gone ahead virtually undisturbed by privacy law suggests that we're at least partly missing the point, and that something more serious, some more forceful measures are necessary in order to make a world that we can be happy with in terms of the way our personal information gets treated. I attribute this partly to what I see as a feature of privacy activism. That is, there are many groups who work very hard to protect privacy values. They seem to me, and I include myself by identification as a supporter of these groups, they seem reactive more than proactive. They always seem to me like volunteer firefighters who are rushing out to testify against backscatter, these naked machines that they have in the airports for security checks, or to testify against the requirements that you disclose more information than you want to disclose to the IRS. And sometimes we win, or sometimes they win, and sometimes they lose. But it seems to me that they're always in this reactive mode. And I would like to, in this book, I'm hoping to write from a different point of view. I want to say, if we were setting out to create a world that takes the fullest possible advantage of information technology and other modern day creature comforts, and still protects people's information to a large extent, gives people lots of choices about whether to participate or not in these information-hungry processes that we're always bumping up against, what kind of world would it be? What kinds of privacy measures would we want to invoke? What kinds of institutions and processes would we want to foster? So in taking privacy seriously, I want to say we reject the notion that technology is somehow a coherent thing that's destroying our privacy of its own will, and that we've lost control over the matters, and instead to say, imagine that we have the wishes and needs that we all have, and that we're willing to use a certain amount of personal information to make a world convenient for certain purposes. What controls on the use of personal information would we most like to be able to see in place that are different and more stringent than the ones that prevail in the world that we live in? And so the book is a short book, and it has, I don't know, 6 or 8 chapters, each of them devoted to a particular thing that we could do much better that we don't. And I'll just flip off a few examples. First of all, we ought to require, and this is perhaps the hardest example to understand, we ought to require what's now normally required in Europe, and that is legal bases for personal data systems. In other words, there should be no systems of mass treatment of personal information that don't have some recognizably larger redeeming social importance. That lets out the commercial data brokers whose work I mentioned a moment ago. I just don't see any redeeming social importance in that in those activities. And I think every personal data system should be regarded a little bit like the system for the use of controlled substances, perhaps desirable in its ultimate ends, but something that requires enormous caution because of the destruction and damage that can happen if these systems go wrong. So first of all, there should be legal bases, which amounts to saying there should be limits to the purposes for which such systems can be created, and they shouldn't be just they shouldn't be just subject to creation at the whim of interested and resourceful parties. Number 2, there should be some kind of national website that is easily accessible by everybody, that would provide current information on what kinds of personal data systems are active, and with proper identification should inform each and every one of us what information about us is in each of those systems. In other words, the costs of finding out about personal information systems, particularly those that affect us, should be greatly reduced. If this country is sophisticated enough to produce a credit score on every single consumer that can be kept up to date from day to day and vary from hour to hour, then it's certainly wealthy enough to produce a single centralized system of access to information about who's watching us. So number two, national information commons in the form of a website that would serve all of these private citizen purposes. Number three, a right to resign from any personal data system that's not required by law. In other words, if things go wrong between you and your credit agency or between you and your insurance policies, and you're so fed up that you'd rather do without, then you should be able to divorce these institutions the way that you divorce some partner who's not working out as a partner. We should take a utilitarian view toward these things and say, thank you, but enough is enough. Another idea, another chapter of the book, the creation of a property right over commercial exploitation of every person's information. In other words, we should all by default have the right not to have information about ourselves bought and sold and traded as it is so widely today. And by extension of this right, we should have the right, I think, to control, to set prices on the sale of any information about ourselves that we would like. You can just imagine how popular an idea like this would be in Silicon Valley. The idea that industries that use personal information as a kind of raw material at very, very low cost should actually have to seek the consent of the people involved for the provision of such information. This is not a formula for comedy among people who follow these things, but I think I'm absolutely prepared to stand behind the proposal. And finally, an extension of privacy monitoring even to law enforcement and national security activities, not to say that they should not enjoy any degree of protection or distinction from other privacy, other personal data systems, but to say that their activities are so important that there should always be somebody who's not part of those institutions, keeping an eye on what practices are current and what actions are being taken. Are these policies and developments that I've described, are they for tomorrow? I would love to tell you that they are. They're radical ideas, they're utopian policies in the best sense of that word. That is, utopian in the sense, I believe, of things that could very well work if only people could be persuaded to give them a try. And that's exactly what social movements always need. They need big, exciting ideas that are not going to be realized right away, because if that were true, then the social movements would be self-limiting, and that would be counterproductive in matters of privacy.
I think I'm going to go stand.
Good.
Thank you to Nanette and my colleagues on the panel and all of you for being here. So I'm talking about an article that I wrote with two colleagues, Celeste Campos Castillo and Christine Horn. Celeste is at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Christine Horn is at Washington State University, both sociologists. And we are thinking about the sociology of privacy. We had similar kinds of questions, and I think, like Sarah talked about too, what is the boundary between self and other, between citizen and state, between consumer and retailer, doctor and patient, or patient and the healthcare system, all of those kinds of things. And we wanted to think, what is the sociological character of privacy and the implications of that? So as probably everyone in this room knows too, that there's a vast literature about privacy in many fields, in law, in history, in political science, in philosophy, in criminology, et cetera. So we are really focused on thinking about it in the social science and even particularly sociological sense. So you might be aware of things, and so I'm happy to talk about those. And we wanted to think about the role of this, the character of privacy and its role in fundamental sociological issues and processes like social order. What is the role of privacy in social order? What is the role of privacy in social relationships, in establishing cohesion in interpersonal relationships and group dynamics? What is the role of privacy in inequality? Fundamental sociological concerns. So we went back into the literature, and I'm a sort of an empirical sociologist. I do quantitative work looking at survey data and doing interviews with people about what they think, how they behave, but this is a theoretical discussion. So Robert Merton in the 50s said, privacy is the regulation of observability. The extent to which an actor's behavior within a group is readily open to observation by others. And privacy, he said, is not merely a personal predilection. It is required to maintain social relations, social structure, and social order. So Merton is echoing some older scholars, legal scholars, and others, but in saying that privacy is inherently social. Now, for some of you, that will not be a surprise, and why am I making a big deal about it? But when we continue to talk about privacy as individual property or as an individual right only, or to talk about privacy as we just need to give people more control about privacy, I think that does fundamental damage to the sociological nature of privacy, because privacy is inherently social, in my view, and I think sociological view. So let's think about this regulation of observability to start to pull apart the idea of privacy as social. So I'm standing here in front of you, and you can observe all kinds of things about me as I'm standing here. Now, in Irving Goffman's words, right, I'm presenting a self to you, and I've worked hard at some of that to present to you particular things, right? Professional dress, I'm presenting the social norm in this kind of setting, but you might be also picking up and able to observe things about you that I maybe didn't want to present, or that I also can't control. Maybe you're a physician who can pick up something about a health characteristic that isn't readily observable to others, et cetera. Or I believe we have people on the web observing this, and maybe they are only getting the audio. Think about what you can observe and know about a person just from hearing the voice versus seeing a person in front of you. So those kinds of characteristics about what this observability means led us to identify sociologically that privacy is access of one social actor to another. That's what we believe is the sort of fundamental nature. And when I say social actor, I mean not only individual people or persons, but any actor who can act in society. So organizations, government, state agencies, et cetera. Unfortunately, you know, the fact that firms are people too under our Constitution is problematic, but that they are social actors as well. Okay, so we're going to think about privacy as social and its access of one social actor to another. Well, what affects access? What affects privacy? We can think about laws, certainly. Going back, I think, Sarah's book, I can't recommend enough to go back and look at some of the history of that, not just the laws, but in, 1898, Warren and Brandeis cited the invention of portable cameras as a threat to privacy. And we've had other sort of legal contention, as we just heard, and Danielle's definitely going to help us understand that. We can think about privacy as access as being inherent in culture, and which changes historically over time and certainly across place. And I'm going to just give two little brief examples of that. So think about clothing, for example, and think about the difference between how we are dressed versus if I was wearing a burqa, for example, as just different ways of mediating access to another person through clothing, which is culturally relevant. We could also think about culture by thinking about something like the social organization of work and the workplace, and just quickly think about the difference between the assembly line versus the cubicle office versus the open office today versus a call center or any of the other various kind of social organization of the workplace. Related to this idea of culture then and the values and the social practices, we can think about social norms. Social norms are the commonly held expectations about characteristics, in this case, of access that are deemed appropriate or not under different conditions. So when is it acceptable to see nearly naked bodies or naked bodies, right? Not something we think about in these kinds of settings, right? Do I observe people in the shower or in a bathroom? Doesn't seem acceptable, except within certain contexts of maybe the family. Maybe in a healthcare setting, in a clinic, but even then, by certain people under certain conditions. But how about at the beach? Lots of nearly naked people walking around all the time, and that's perfectly acceptable. And so those, not just culture, but norms in the context matter. And some of you might be familiar with Helen Nissenbaum's great work on the contextual integrity of privacy, which is what is private really depends on not just what the access is, but the context in which that access occurs, which is relevant. And we may have individual preferences for privacy, for access. That's certainly true. I might want to wear a cover up over my bathing suit, and Sarah wants to wear a bikini, for example, right? We have different preferences there, but it's within the context of the larger social norms and culture. Neither one of us are wearing a bathing suit in this setting, right? So those things matter. And just finally, of course, part of the reason we're here and the reason we're talking about this so much now is that technology is affecting this idea of access. And I think it was James Rule's early work who said, any technology that changes dimensions that we can communicate, that changes monitoring or visibility of people, and it makes that more widely available, is going to affect privacy because it affects our access to one another. And you can think about your favorite privacy or technology examples. So privacy is social. It's inherently social. It's relational. It's embedded in culture. It's mediated by norms and other factors. So one implication of recognizing that privacy is social is that these models of protecting privacy centered around control, centered around the individual, centered around only individual rights, rather than protecting social goods or thinking about the collective action problem, as Nanette said, is going to be limited and not, in my view, and I think a sociological view, as James said, protective of enough of us. Just quickly, I'm going to go through too. So the way privacy matters then for social cohesion and interpersonal relationships. We have to balance revealing and concealing not only information, but access to ourselves in order to develop intimacy, to develop interpersonal trust. And too much in any one direction is actually problematic. And lots of sociologists have talked about this over the years. Irving Goffman, again, talked about the idea of civil inattention. That sometimes when we are in public settings, we want to not have that much access to other people. So think about yourself on the subway or the bus or the public transportation, where we're going to ignore that person over there is crying, maybe, because they don't want to be viewed. That civil inattention helps us maintain social interaction. Sometimes it can be too much. Maybe we really do ignore the homeless people or the people who have need in our environment too much. And in fact, when I present this and I present slides, it's easy to find images of people on public transit. But the images that I've used from, say, 2011, 2012, when you can clearly see on a crowded bus civil inattention, right? You're standing this close to somebody and you're, very carefully not looking at each other or attending to each other. And now everyone is just like this on their device. And so that might be actual inattention and not just civil inattention. And another sociologist, Barry Schwartz, actually said that privacy, or that limited access in those public settings, is a means of making life with the unbearable possible, which I kind of love that. So another way privacy is social is that I not only want to sometimes limit or manage your access to me or others' access to me, I want to manage my access to others. So I don't always want all of the information from others. I want to maintain civil inattention. Even people like Schwartz and Goffman talked about as well, needing to limit the amount of information you have or the amount of access you have even to other loved ones to maintain those social relationships. So that's privacy and social cohesion. How about privacy and social order, the extent to which a social group can cooperate to create collective goods, like democracy, like other kinds of collective productive goods, like economic well-being and safety. So privacy and social order are interconnected because visibility and monitoring is actually key to producing social order. We have to ensure that people follow the rules, follow laws, pay their taxes, perform according to the norms, are in compliance with not just the big rules, the policies and laws, but also with social norms, that they aren't sexually harassing people, like Danielle's great work shows us. And so as we develop technology, we change patterns of behavior and interaction that change how we have access to one another, how we can make behavior visible. For example, by exposing that some people don't take their medication, which medicine and health insurance defines as non-compliance, might, and therefore might change the way they pay for that medication for those patients, or how we might start to think about those people. That's very different for thinking about those collective goods that we produce versus when that behavior is not monitored, is not visible to those other parties. Those kinds of things are important and necessary. As that visibility increases, one reaction, one way social order can be undermined is that people resist. People fight back. So there's already evidence of that. For example, in the monitoring that now takes place in lots of workplaces, people trying to avoid the camera, avoid being observed. That can lead to, lower productivity, if you care about that, or other kinds of problems. And then finally, privacy and inequality. People in this room might be very familiar with that, but to the extent that privacy is a resource, Like other resources, it is certainly unequally distributed in society. It is tied to other kinds of social characteristics like status and power and economic resources. So just again, think about the households and a tenement house or versus a gated community, right? The influence of that. Think about it in hierarchies. Think about the power that the boss has over the employee and the access that actor has, the boss has compared to the employee. We know that people's ability to, for example, sign up for do not call lists back when we cared about those things and used regular phones, to today who participates in organizations like LifeLock or those things that protect us more online, it's tied to social and economic resources. So the sociological character of privacy as access and the social nature of privacy means that it is part of the social fabric in which inequality produces differences in privacy, and privacy, the extent to which you have it or don't, has implications for inequality. So we know that for example, being unequally targeted for negative attention in the criminal justice system, for example, is unequally distributed. Black neighborhoods, people with Black African-American sounding names are more likely to be targeted online and by police than people in white neighborhoods or with white sounding names, for example. And that's true not only in criminal justice, but we see that also in, say, employee tracking, resume tracking kinds of behavior. So privacy and inequality are linked. So finally, I'm just going to end with the thinking about the sociological character of privacy as access. We can think about what I would call the first order effects that many of us are really concerned about and thinking about, which is how changes in any one of these factors, particularly technology, which is what most of us are focused on, affects access and what it, more or less, and the implications of that, and how actors might attempt to manage that. But I think we also really want to think about these what I would call the second order effects. When you start to change access, visibility of social actors in society, that has consequences for inequality, social order, social cohesion, what are the consequences of that for the organization of society, for culture, for the functioning of society? And that, I think, is where we're not really there in our scholarship, and we're not really thinking through that to the extent that our world is changing because of that. And so I think I'll end there. Thank you.
So I think I'm going to stay right here. And I was going to talk about my book, Hate Crimes in Cyberspace, which is about cyber stalking. But I'd like to talk about my newest work, a piece that just came out in Yale Law Journal called Sexual Privacy. And I think it ties together or brings together, Denise, you were talking about bodies, and Sarah in your book, bathrooms, and James, social movements. Because I'm going to bring all that together in 8 minutes, or I'm going to try. And I think it's particularly significant here because at Berkeley, we know we've just had bathrooms. People put cameras in women's bathrooms, taping them, and the police are looking into it. And it's a phenomenon that is not unusual for the United States, though we increasingly see it in other countries. So what do I mean by, so let me explain what I mean by sexual privacy. The kinds of invasions of sexual privacy that my work tackles and will be my newest book. So sexual privacy, as I'm defining it, are the attitudes, expectations, and context in which we manage the boundaries around our intimate life. So it is about the naked body and the parts of the body that we associate with sex and gender and access to the body. It's also about our intimate activities and the zones in which our intimate activities occur, and the communications that we have between intimates on the basis of confidentiality and trust. And it's the decisions we make about with whom we share our naked bodies, our information about our intimate lives, and the kinds of confidences that we share with other people. And so invasions of sexual privacy that I've been studying and worked on with lawmakers, and I'll explain a little bit about social movements too, include, so for example, an invasion of sexual privacy is of course video voyeurism. So that's the planting of video cameras in bathrooms or bedrooms unexpectedly and unwanted and without consent. It's upskirt photos and down blouse photos. Like, believe it or not, there are people who have cameras that they buy sneakers. I'm not joking you. This is the stuff I study. You're like horrified. With cameras on their sneakers. And so they tape women, and it's usually women and people from marginalized communities. But for the upskirt photo, you get underneath someone's skirt in a Walmart. Believe it or not, there's so many criminal cases, you're going to be horrified, in which they tape women up their skirts, and then they share our online communities that trade upskirt photos and down blouse photos. It includes sextortion, which is the phenomenon of either coercing or tricking someone into sharing a nude photo online, and it could be like you impersonate someone and you pretend that you're a beautiful young woman, you contact that person on Facebook, you coerce a young man to share a nude photo of his genitals or a videotape of taping himself masturbating. And then once they've done that, then you can say to the person, I'm going to share that with your parents, with your friends, with your colleagues, unless you send more nude photos or perform sex acts before video cams. And usually sextortionists have thousands of victims across the country and world. Non-consensual pornography. The non-consensual posting of someone's nude photos more often will happen to women and LGBTQ folks and people of color. And lastly, deep fake sex videos. So you use technology that creates digital fabrications of people, and you put their faces into pornography. So we saw that the subreddit devoted to celebrity deepfake sex videos, but it's not just celebrities like Amber Heard and Scarlett Johansson, Emma Watson. Journalists, ordinary people have had, college students have had their faces morphed into pornography. And the technology is not as sophisticated as I think we're going to see in 2 years, where it's going to be virtually undetectable. Very difficult to figure out that it's not consensual pornography, right, versus the deep fake sex video. So how so in my work, both in this law review article and in my new book project, I argue that sexual privacy is of paramount importance, that it is a privacy interest that, as we understand the ordering of privacy, that it ought to be understood as a privacy interest of the first order. Much as we think about health privacy, children's privacy, and as my dear friend Neil Richards will call intellectual privacy, the privacy of our thoughts, right? The books that we read, right? It's so indispensable, and I'm going to tie a little bit, so I feel like we've done bathrooms and bodies, right? A bit, Denise, to the values that you talked about for privacy. So why does sexual privacy matter, right? It matters because it's crucial to sexual agency, right? Like when you want to share with someone that you're transgender or that you've had a childhood sexual assault, it is crucial to your self-definition to decide when that is. And especially true for young people. Janet Mock wrote this beautiful book about sort of her, she's a trans woman. And when she moved from Hawaii to New York, it was after her transition surgery, and she worked at Vogue. And she explains in her autobiography, she just wanted to be a young woman working at Vogue. She didn't want to explain to people who she didn't have that intimacy and close connection with that she was trans. She didn't want to have to always be that person. Like, she was the trans woman working at Vogue, right? And it's crucial to how we think about ourselves, to have the ability to decide with whom we share our bodies and make those choices. And it's crucial, sexual agency, to human dignity, right? To be able to make those choices in who you share your bodies with and your sexual orientation. It shows respect for oneself, right? And as well as enjoying community respect, right? The social bases of respect. Not being just a vagina, right? Your nude photo is posted online. And so I'll just tell you two quick stories about in a second. But first, sexual agency, right? And it's indispensable, Denise, as you said, to intimacy, right? You know, intimacy, how we develop it, is about reciprocal vulnerability, right? And it's through mutual disclosure and reciprocal vulnerability that we develop relationships. And sexual privacy is indispensable to that, right? The self-revelation, mutual revelation, and mutual vulnerability is based on trust, right? And confidence. That when you share a nude photo with a lover, and God bless, if you're over 18, please, I pray we at someday feel we can do these things, right? But you have to do it on the basis of trust, right, and confidence. And Denise, your mention of equality, right? So sexual agency and intimacy, and are inevitably, because of the way we culturally exist, that the bodies and sexual activities of women and people of color, LGBTQ folks, are viewed with, we know, or they're stigmatized. They're just seen with disgust, as Martha Nussbaum would explain. And that there is a deep and intersectional basis on which, so think of Leslie Jones, she's targeted online, famous SNL, right, celebrity. And on Twitter, people put up her, after the Ghostbusters movie comes out, right, she's punished, right, for being exquisite that she is. And photos, doctored photographs of her as if she was naked are posted on Twitter, along with her home address. Pictures of her morphed onto, so she looks like a monkey. So there's like racism and sexism and gendered abuse sort of boiled together, rape threats and death threats aplenty. And so she goes offline, right? And so and what we do see in my work on sexual privacy is that women and minorities, and often on an intersectional basis, are the ones most likely to be targeted and the ones most likely to have economic effects, right? Because when your nude photo appears in a Google search of your name, it's the job you never know you didn't get, right? And teachers have lost their, especially parochial schools, have lost their jobs. Just so like stories go around about this. Like if your nude photo as a woman is in a Google search of your name, schools will, especially elementary schools, have fired a number of women in very high profile stories because the response is we can't have parents Googling you, right? And so just going to end with, I'm going to then move to social movements in a second, but two women's stories. Holly Jacobs, when she was in graduate school, she had graduated from Boston College and went to FIU. She's getting her PhD. And she had a long distance relationship with someone. And when they broke up, about a month later, she starts getting texts and emails that say, I'm looking forward to coming over to your house. I saw your ad for sex. And she's, at the time, this was 2009, wasn't accustomed to Googling herself. She hadn't gotten the message from all of us. It's 2009. And what she finds are over 300 pages of her nude photos of videotape, of her masturbating, right? And posted all on adult finder sites, on revenge porn sites, on sort of Craigslist, and some with impersonations and ads saying she was interested in rape fantasies and was available for sex. Some, she was getting her PhD, so she had grad students. The tagline was hot for teacher, Holly and her former last name, interested in sex. And she went to her associate dean at FIU to explain what was going on, and the person said, what is this? And she explained, I think it's my ex. I'm working really hard with notice and takedown requests, which are being ignored, to take down these photos. And the dean said, you know what? I'm going to have to suggest to you that you change your name. Because we can't have students at FIU Googling you. And she did. Right? So now, and sort of the happy social movement part of the story, I'm telling you a little bit about Holly Jacobs. But, and Annie Seyfullah, just more recently, was a principal at a high school in Staten Island. And she was living with someone. This was, she had gotten divorced and living with a man. And he found, as they were kind of, their relationship is deteriorating, he found on her old laptop photos of her that she had shared with her ex-husband. And he took the photos, he uploaded them onto her Department of Education laptop. He showed the laptop to the superintendent of New York schools. He sent the photos to the New York Post with the story that she was sleeping with her students, which was untrue. And the New York Post runs with a story, teacher sexually abusing young boys in schools, right? So it runs in the New York Post. Photos of her in sort of very slinky, they're not nude, but they're very slinky and revealing, are in the New York Post. And she's fired, right? And the Department of Education sort of puts her in what they call a rubber room in New York. Like, she gets a salary, but she's waiting for the hearing. And at the hearing, it's shown, she has wonderful counsel, I get her a lawyer, Carrie Goldberg, and it's shown, it's very clear that all of this is made up. It's defamatory. And the school says, we still have to fire you. We cannot have you as a superintendent, someone who was on the page 6 of the New York Post, right? So social movements, right? How do we respond to this? In 2014, when Marianne Franks and I wrote the sort of first article on revenge porn, we called it Criminalizing Revenge Porn, there are 2 states that criminalize the practice of non-consensual pornography. And Holly Jacobs went from totally in hiding to change her name to Holly Jacobs and found the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which was going to fight against non-consensual pornography and other forms of online abuse. And through that organization, I'm the vice president, and Marianne Franks is the president. We now have 47 states in DC that criminalize the practice, and this is only it's 2019, so we started working on this in 2014. So what's today? Forgive me, this is what happens if you travel too much. It's Friday. Last week, okay, today's Thursday. So last week, on Tuesday, Congresswoman Jackie Speer rolled out the SHIELD Act, which is the federal non-consensual pornography law. Amber Heard is our CCRI ambassador. So Amber Heard gave a talk. Our president, Marianne Franks. We have now bipartisan support for the bill. And so the sort of very small little bunch of warriors that we were in 2014, we are seeing massive legal change, right? So in my book projects, and I know I'm clearly over, not sure if I'm over 8 minutes, but okay. I'm going to write about how law needs to have a comprehensive approach to sexual privacy, both for expressive reasons and coercive ones. So that's the new law review article and project that I'm working on, hopefully tying together some of the themes that we had in our panel. So thank you.
So my goal in organizing this session was to give you all a little light summer reading, to give you some different books and articles and things to consider, and I think we've done that, and I want to make sure we honor the way that this event normally unfolds and give you a chance to network with each other and also with our speakers. But is there anybody with a burning question that they'd really like to ask, or do we want to do more informal networking? What do you think?
Is that a real disencouragement to ask the question?
No, not at all. You have a question?
I did, a little bit. I think it's for...
Let's get you the microphone. Hold on one second.
Oh, yeah, here.
I think it's partly triggering one of the chapters in your book, Susan, on architecture, but the talk of bodies and sense of agency. I'd really love to hear you each, or at least say a few words about privacy and loneliness, and how they relate, and where. What I remember from your book is this endless quest. As soon as we have the resources, we create more and more privacy. We wall ourselves off from others, and yet we end up lonelier. And this must tie in somehow to the things you've been talking about. I had no idea where you take it, but if you just have any thoughts, I'd love to hear.
I feel like you need a copy of the Non-Citizen and like need to wait it out.
I actually have a copy.
I know you do. If you want to roll it down there.
Thank you. Well, Thank you for, thanks for having the book. I was telling someone earlier that I don't tend to travel with it because it's so darn long and heavy. So.
I've traveled with it.
Well, gosh, that is so kind of you. Thank you for saying that. I think privacy is it's one of those, I mean, to me, incredibly fascinating, but to many, vexing concepts because it has so many different shades of meaning and so many kind of cognates. One of, isolation, solitude, but loneliness, equally, has its kind of overlap with the concept of privacy. And I guess one quick response to your question about the relationship is that when people talk about wanting privacy, they don't want loneliness. They don't want total isolation. What they want is some sort of say in their relationships, their boundaries, their kind of circles of intimacy, right? And so yes, I mean, even in the quest for privacy, sometimes people find that they don't get what they want. In political theory, and there are people who've written about problems of loneliness and kind of alienation from others as being it's really an equal problem to the fact of hypervisibility or surveillance. And so I think what everybody, to speak very broadly, is looking for is some kind of balance, right? Is some sort of space to connect and also be apart from other people. And so this is why it's really problematic to talk about privacy as an all or nothing thing. It's always this shifting kind of, graded line. And we really misunderstand it and probably create policies and laws that are inapt when we don't recognize that. Which is probably nothing you hadn't already thought about. But that's my quick take. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
This is very quick, but a fascinating study is the growth of privacy instincts and needs among small children. They don't start off with any privacy sensibility whatsoever. I used to think when my kids were small, I would never want to instill shame on them. But after a few extremely embarrassing dinner parties where the children were virtually mooning the guests, I began to pray for the rise of shame. It seems to take care of itself. I don't know the mechanism, but if you wanted another career, you could take that problem on.
Just somewhat differently, just a quick point, which is it's not exactly applicable about loneliness, which is typically as Sarah said, and James too, in interpersonal kinds of relationships. But I was reminded of Michelle Gelman, Danielle's colleague. It's a law review article from a couple of years ago, but talking about how the role in inequality, and that some people have too much privacy, essentially, in that, so I talked about resources being connected to the inability to manage privacy or protect your own privacy. But what she talks about is how poor people generally, or people with low resources, are given too much privacy so that we don't have a social obligation to attend to their needs. And so they are invisible in front of the law or in front of organizations or agencies who should have their interests at heart. But if we don't know, then we don't have to be obligated or responsible to them. So it's not loneliness in the feeling of it, but it is that flip side of the downside of too much privacy, like loneliness is at the individual level, I think.
Right, and for the poor, the typical story is, of course, the administrative that knows everything about them, get public benefits. So it's too little privacy, and Michelle's story is interesting about the homeless, and too much privacy, right? So, the notion of privacy, though, I guess for me, is a way in which we think of group privacy, let's not forget, and that as between intimates, That is the salve to loneliness, right? Is the ability to have privacy with intimates. So it is true, of course, when you're alone, it doesn't mean that you're lonely, but we often think of privacy as the antidote to loneliness.
So a question for Professor Citron. You mentioned the role of social movements in your research. And this immediately made me think of Carrie Goldberg, who you mentioned, and other organizations like Reputation.com that have helped victims of... Okay.
Commercial business model.
Yeah.
Not like Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, not a process in which we make no money.
Well,
We're on a shoestring.
well, Carrie Goldberg is also a,
she's a practitioner.
plaintiff's bar lawyer too, so she has...
Fabulous.
So regardless of what the incentive is, they're sort of going towards the same end, right? Anyway, that you don't have to answer that. But what? How would you characterize? Yeah.
People, but you have to be very wealthy to afford it.
Oh, yeah.
$10,000 a month. So it's not available to the victims who I write about. Really not available to them.
Yeah. So either way, so what role would you say that advocates like these have sort of had in the social movement side of this? And, how have their successes and frustrations on the way kind of shaped the legislation that we finally helped see and
Yeah.
other outcomes?
Yeah, no, so advocacy groups have played a huge role. So I'm on the board of also the Electronic Privacy Information Center, and their support for our work in Cyber Civil Rights Initiative has been tremendous. And yes, we've had setbacks. I have to say, of the 47 laws in DC, poor Marianne Franks has worked with every lawmaker across the country, and I wish they'd just listened to her. Because when it comes out of committee, the laws are just either, and this is true of my experience working with lawmakers in Maryland, too narrow and too broad. It came out broken, and law enforcement doesn't enforce it. So we realized we've gotten the battle of hearts and minds to take this seriously. When I first started working on this stuff, I wrote this article called Cyber Civil Rights in 2008. And the response to me was, Danielle, get over yourself. This is so not a big deal. Why are you fixating on a few people? And you're going to break the internet by dealing with cyber stalking. And I have to say, it's a beautiful world 11 years later in which I'm not crazy. This is a big deal, right? And folks like Jennifer Lawrence have sort of joined the cause in helping us conceive and understand. When celebrities go to, Vanity Fair and say, this is an invasion, this is sexual violence, right? And people really hear her. We've been helped out by having sort of voices like Amber Heard and other celebrities sort of join us to bring sort of prominence to the suffering of really, by my lights, who I write about, are the everyday person, the nurse, the lawyer, the person who works in social services, the social worker, so and the student. So social movements have been, so think about sexual harassment in the workplace, which before, in the early 60s was no big deal, right? It was a perk of the workplace for men to enjoy. It was certainly not actionable under Title VII. And law actually comes first, right? You had courts recognize that under Title VII, hostile work environments violate civil rights obligations. And what had been burgeoning was a growing movement, the women's movement, Lynn Farley and others, having meetups, but it's kind of muted. But then law changes, and it is this iterative process of law signaling that this is wrong. And social movements coming to the fore and saying, damn right? And when Anita Hill testifies in the Thomas hearing, the EEOC went from having very low numbers of complaints of sexual harassment in the workplace to hundreds of thousands. It was enormous, sort of that educative role of, you might call her an advocate in some sense, right? So we have seen, in this case, advocacy coming first, legal scholarship and advocacy about cyber harassment and non-consensual pornography coming first. Then we started to work with lawmakers. God bless, we got their attention, right? And imperfect laws, and not well enforced, because we still trivialize the practice. We're still running up in law enforcement that say it's your fault. You're an idiot. Why did you share the nude photo, turns out the guy coerced her. Or, right, it was in a relationship of trust and confidence. So we see both social movements affecting law and law affecting social movements. And we're just really at the beginning of the story for us in the work that we do, in the work that I do. But it is heartening, right? And certainly we are in a moment for privacy, working with lawmakers on the Hill. They're imperfect laws, but there's a Schatz bill and a Rubio bill. I mean, there's so many bills. I'm working with federal lawmakers, and I'm like every day on the phone with another one. You really want to have a bill? Okay. And you have Adam Schiff. I'm going to go testify before Congress about deepfakes. And they are paying attention. So we're picking up some speed, right? In a way that I think is kind of a moment for us, those of us we've been going to Privacy Law Scholars Conference. We started in 2008. Now we're a huge conference, and IRGP has 30,000 practitioners. So I think you're going to be a bestseller with the why privacy is important matters, right? And please buy Sarah's book. I literally ate it up, and I did take it on a train ride. It is heavy. And I think because I had read drafts, like blessedly, like you had presented some of it, so I was like dying to get through the whole thing. And I think it took me like 2 weeks. It's amazing. So, okay, I'm like a little press operation for Sarah. But we did not coordinate this, just saying.
Okay, I guess my last question for you all then is who are you reading? Sort of who's off the radar right now that we all need to know about that's a burgeoning scholar in this space? Where are the green shoots? Where's the new things coming out? That's my last question.
Okay. So, yeah, I think everyone should read Woody Hartzog's Privacy's Blueprint. And thinking about design and privacy and the design of our technologies and how privacy, it's so compelling too, and I love that he talks about, the IoT of underwear. Like, do we really need networked underwear, And how we ought to think about design, whether it's the website, databases, and primarily it's like consumer-facing stuff that he talks about. But it's really like, it's both fun and interesting and gets you to think about privacy. He has a PhD in from the communication school at UNC. Anyway, and also second, it's going to be privacy and sociology. Privacy is Trust by Ari Waldman. And really rich and interesting. He's both a PhD in sociology from Columbia as well as a law degree. He teaches at New York Law School, and it's fantastic. So I'm good with books for friends, right? Yeah. Sorry to say two. I'm probably only supposed to do one.
I further recommend the Privacy by Design.
You mean Privacy's Blueprint?
Privacy
Woody's book?
Blueprint,
Yeah.
yes. It's a very learned book, but it's also exciting and full of new things that you never thought of that could be done if there were enough attention and will to make existing systems more privacy friendly. People talk as though we all agreed on what it means to make social life more private, and in fact we don't, because often one party's privacy is another person's danger or manipulation even. So we're always working to adjudicate relations between contending interests, which may be all of them valid. In other words, we should never ever attempt to persuade ourselves that good values are only opposed by bad values. But still, in the world that I live in, which is more than perhaps the other speakers, a world of macro institutions and large-scale policies, it's difficult for me to believe that all of the one-sided claims on personal information that we're constantly confronted with are valid. And since the other side isn't talking, since the people on the collecting and analyzing and using side of personal information generally have managed to keep themselves afloat by not disclosing how many terrorists are actually caught by these secret practices. We're at a disadvantage. So still, we have to, I think, start with the premise that privacy values are always in tension with other legitimate values. You don't want to insist even on your most intimate partner on knowing everything but everything. You'll destroy the relationship if anything in the life is certain. But my plea is that we apply this same kind of judicious logic to the great big macro issues of our time. Who's going to keep track of what each and every one of us is saying over the internet or by telephone or over email? And there, I think we've got a much more one-sided picture than in face-to-face life.
I have too many things going through my mind in terms of what I would recommend. So I want to make a quirky suggestion. I think some of what we need is a different kind of imagination around the kind of privacy that we want, and we're very much trapped and kind of hedged in by current circumstances and current conventions. And so I'm a big advocate of reading fiction and science fiction and sort of other kind of cultural accounts of social life and organization, and trying to think through those kinds of texts into other ways that we might imagine those boundaries between ourselves and others.
So I would like to begin by thanking all of you for coming. This is the first time we've attempted to coordinate this event with the Privacy Law Scholars Conference, and your attendance and the types of questions that we got and the amazing scholars that we were able to convene have told me that this is something we should try and do again. Please definitely let the folks at Mozilla Privacy Lab know if you enjoyed this. We also appreciate Citrus and also the Townsend Center for the Humanities and the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, which were kind enough to sponsor this event so that we could have it here. So thank you all for coming. Please feel free to linger, talk with our speakers, and also please eat all of that food so I do not have to carry it home with me. Thank you so much for coming. Have a wonderful evening.